Okay, so let's call this Parliamentary Procedure 101. Over the next little time I have with you, the goal really is to do a nice overview, get some questions asked and answered and whatnot. And normally whenever I give a presentation like this, my main rule is as long as everyone walks away here learning one new thing, that means it was some time well spent, right? And so that's kind of the goal here. And I get really excited about this stuff, and sometimes I can talk fast when I get excited, so if you need me to slow down or repeat myself, please interrupt me, not a big deal. Raise your hand if you have a question, you want to interrupt me, you need to ask me, repeat myself, whatever the case is. So let's just go next couple of slides real quickly. That's me. Basically, I'm not just let you know, I have credentials, not some stranger off the street, but I'm what's called a professional registered parliamentarian, and that is the credential offered by the National Association of Parliamentarians, the highest one, and it requires testing, knowledge of Robert's Rules of Order, demonstrations, etc. And so outside of this, the pastor had just said, I help out different groups of all different types of engagements, whether that's nonprofits, corporations, HOAs, whatever the case may be. So these are just some credentials to let you know I'm not some person off the street. Keep going. Sample clients, keep going. And yeah, one more. And just other examples of things I've done. Okay, so now we'll go to the next slide. And with that, this presentation is really designed to kind of start at that 50,000 foot level, right? We're going to start kind of broadly at the top and then get more and more specific. And so we're going to kind of take a step back and really ask, what is Robert's Rules of Order exactly before we get into the nitty gritty of how you use it and what's in the book and whatnot. But before I begin these presentations, I'd like to start off with a story. And the story begins like this. It actually begins in a place much like we're in right now. There was a minister, and he asked this man to, please lead our annual meeting that's coming up. And he said, you know what, Pastor? I don't really know how to, but I'm going to give it a try. And he gave it a try, and it went really bad. He wrote in his journal later that night that this was the most chaotic thing I've been a part of. And what he did was he didn't give up. He vowed to do better the next time. And so he went to the library and got books and sources and figured out, okay, how do I do a meeting? He wrote himself down a little notebook, little notes, and it ended up being a little handbook that he wrote. And then the next meeting, when the minister asked him to preside at that meeting one more time, it went very successfully. And the name of that man was Henry Martin Robert, actually. And so that's a story from the 1800s, and that's sort of how Robert's Rules of Order came to exist. Pardon me. People think, oh, Roberts must have been this fancy lawyer and stuff like that. And no, he was actually an engineer by trade. He was an engineer who was asked to lead a church meeting and wanted to know how. And so that little pocket guide that he wrote for himself ended up, being published and produced. And now it's the #1 selling book in North America on the subject of how to do business meetings. And lots of different groups adopt it and use it as the guide. And so it's almost like a universal experience where we are thrown in a situation where we might end up wanting to know more, right? And so that's just to say that you're not alone. If you ever had a question or you thought, oh, how should this been done and whatnot, that's exactly what happened with Mr. Roberts back in the 1800s. And for him, that curiosity ended up being him becoming a best-selling author on a book subject. So I like to share that story to kind of begin to kind of let you know. It's always great when you're doing this at a church, because that's sort of how this all came about, funny enough. So, water right here. Okay. So let's go to the next slide. So, parliamentary procedure. What exactly is parliamentary procedure? And so when we talk about parliamentary procedure, someone here, raise your hand. Have you ever heard of majority rules? Raise your hand, right? We all have, right? And so, even if you think back to elementary school, when you're trying to figure out with your friends, like, what are we gonna do at recess that day, right? You got with your friends together, you put some proposals out there. Let's do the swings, no, let's run around the track, let's do hopscotch, right? You had a little bit of debate. Oh, it's kind of, it might rain, so the hopscotch is gonna get ruined, and we did the track last time, so let's do the swings instead, right? And then you come to a consensus about what exactly you're going to do. That's essentially the name of the game here. Parliamentary procedure is facilitating majority rules. And we just growing up in a democratic society, that is just how we've come to kind of make group decisions, right? And so the stakes are a little bit higher these days when you're older than what you're gonna do at recess, but the principles are still the same. You're putting a proposal out there, you're discussing the merits, the pros and cons of it, and you're coming to a group consensus to see if that's what the action the group is going to undertake. And so majority rules, parliamentary procedure is sort of facilitating that because as we get older and the problems get more serious, I guess you could say, right, you need a little bit more structure to help facilitate the group decision-making process. And so that's why we kind of have the little definition on the slide. It's the name, giving the tradition of rules and whatnot that for the civilized world dealing with meeting problems. But the purpose of parliamentary procedure is to facilitate the orderly transaction of business, and it should not be used to awe or entangle or confuse people. The rules need to be used to the extent necessary to observe the law, to expedite business, and to avoid confusion and to protect the rights of members. And so so kind of have that in the back of your mind throughout the day. We're getting to majority rules essentially. And so next slide. So what is Robert's Rules of Order? So Robert's Rules of Order is what's called a parliamentary authority or a book on parliamentary procedure essentially. Looks like this, right? See, the 12th edition, I don't see it, they use like a cream color, and so it gets kind of dusty. The other editions are like brown or gold and stuff like that, and so that's my gripe with the 12th edition. It's a little dirty with the cream color. But parliamentary procedure, Robert's Rules of Order, they aren't necessarily synonymous. They're not the same term. Robert's Rules of Order is one book on parliamentary procedure. Now, it's also the most widely used book on parliamentary procedure. So if you know this, you can pretty much kind of interact with all different types of groups and organizations, but it's one book. I think the main different one that you'll kind of see maybe on your day-to-day is when you're really dealing with like governmental bodies like a Congress, a city council and things like that, they have more specialized business, right? Because they're dealing with like bills that have to balance between houses and might get vetoed and everything. Most groups don't deal with that, right? And so they don't need specialized rules for that. So that's why the team, when this is written, it's really written to be widely applicable to the most applicable groups possible, and they recognize that, hey, what we say, it might not be exactly what you want to do, but that's okay. You just need to make sure it's put into your rules elsewhere, right? And then you can kind of do it that way. And so they recognize that even though we try to write to a wide audience, we might not necessarily, we're not going to be able to fit every single group's psychology throughout our country, right? And so they recognize that. And so if you look on the slide, there are lots of different sources from where you might get your rules. And if you kind of see towards the parliamentary authority is kind of there towards the bottom. And so we'll kind of start from the top really quickly and just to show you an example of what that means. And so we always start with like the law, right? When we're operating any sort of group here in this country, you have to make sure you're doing it legally. And so one example of that is I'm trying to look for it in here. Actually, it's probably one of those, but let's just say I want to hold a meeting, right? Where I'm from in Virginia, I have a person called the fire marshal, right? And so I can't just hold my meeting anywhere or else it might be an illegal assembly, right? So even though Robert's rules or bylaws might say, oh, just call the meeting place, you still have to observe like what the local or state law might be. And so I can't host a 100-person gathering in my one-bedroom condo, right? I have to still observe what the local law is, and local law says, you have to make sure it's a big enough place, right, because of fire safety and whatnot. And so that's where things might happen. Or if you're like at a specialized group like a credit union or a homeowners association or a corporation, there might be like the state laws that might have like certain things that you have to do for like your meetings, right? And so whatever the law says, you do that first because you have to follow the law. After that, you have your governing documents, right? Like your bylaws, your constitution, your articles of incorporation. And those in itself might have different rules, and those are going to be nice and organizationally specific, right? And so, like, you know, Robert's rules is not going to address like, oh, and if you're this type of church, make sure you have this type of pastor or this type of minister and whatnot. But no, you're going to have that in your governing documents of we are led this way by this type of person, right? Or this is how we put this person into this role because it's more specific for your organization. And what the main key I have here for you to learn though is if you notice governing documents is sort of at the top right, Robert's parliamentary authority towards the bottom. So if it's in your bylaws, follow what your constitution or bylaws say. Like Robert says, follow your bylaws before you follow us. And so if there's ever like a conflict or, oh, I heard this and I heard that, try to see if you can get it if it's in your bylaws first. If it's in your bylaws, that's what your answer is. Then if it's not addressed in your bylaws, then you can kind of try to go to Roberts and whatnot and get your question addressed. If you look at the very, very, very bottom, it says custom and practice. Custom practice, that's just the way we've always done things. And the way you've always done things can be a legitimate way at proceeding, but the issue is if how you've always done things goes against your rules that you already have in place, you need to stop doing what you're doing or update your documents to incorporate that practice to make sure it is like a valid thing that you're doing. Custom and practice might be, you know, maybe on a ballot you put the people in alphabetical order, for example, right? Like you've always done it this way, or so-and-so gets to speak first at the meetings, like little things like that are that are sort of like those unwritten rules, but just remember if those like unwritten rules are go against like what you're supposed to be doing, like in your bylaws or in Robert's Rules of Order, that's when you need to kind of stop or incorporate that practice. Were there any questions about these documents or the order of anything?
What is RONR?
Oh, thank you. I forgot to point that out. So, RONR, Robert's Rules of Order Newly Revised. That's the acronym for it. And so if you ever see RONR on a slide, that's I'm talking about. This book right here. Yeah, they do, I guess Robert's Rules of Order, so RO and the newly revised NR. But that's what they chose for their acronym. Let's see, any other questions? Okay, next slide. And so, as we kind of conclude this sort of overall 50,000-foot view of what is parliamentary procedure, we also have to address sort of like what are your fundamental rights that you have being a group that observes the democratic process, right? And so with your parliamentary procedure, sort of some fundamental rights that you have. Number one, using parliamentary procedure, you're supposed to consider one thing at a time. And that's important because it keeps the meeting on track. It helps people make sure we know exactly what we're supposed to be discussing and voting on, so we don't get confused. Because, if you're here and you're brainstorming here and then, you're talking about this, you're talking about that. Let's take a vote on it. Wait, you're taking a vote on what Jeff just said, or we're taking a vote on the thing that we were originally talking about, right? And so kind of focusing on the thing, make sure it's one thing at a time. That's going to help make sure people are on the same page. Majority rules is the next fundamental principle. We had discussed that. That's pretty much the name of the game here. It's what we're trying to get to, which is whatever the group's consensus. We measure the group's consensus by majority vote, and majority means more than half, right? And so, ideally, if it's if you distill a question down to yes, no, the majority is going to be the side that has more than half. That means there's more people who voted support something than did not support something. And so whenever you hear me say like majority, minority throughout this presentation, we're talking about, I guess the quote unquote winning side and the quote unquote like losing side. There's not necessarily, they're not necessarily winners and losers. I hate, kind of assigning that adjective to like things and people, right? But that's why we kind of use the majority side, minority side. So the whole goal, though, is just because the majority is sort of deciding, it's not supposed to be like with an iron fist and without like any sort of input, right? And so just because you might not be on the prevailing side of something, you still have the right to give that input. You still have the right to debate the issue and try to get people to come to your side, maybe offer an alternative, right? Because the majority of today could be the minority of tomorrow because we make a decision and it ends up not being the best decision, right? So we need to change course and whatever the case may be. And so that's why it's important to kind of treat people still with fairness and good faith, because just because you might not be in agreement on this one thing doesn't necessarily mean it's always going to be that way, because things can happen and new information can come into play and you kind of switch what you're doing, right? And another fundamental principle with parliamentary procedure is the people who are voting on things are people who are like members of the organization. They're the ones who are people who are at that meeting who are present, able to like vote on something. Because the whole idea is you as a group, right? You each collectively registering your yes or your no, your approval or your disapproval. And if enough of you say yes to something, you're acting in consort, like you're binding the group as a whole, essentially. So that's like what we're getting at. And in the introduction of Roberts, it actually really talks about why decisions by majority vote with debate are important, because people have had the right to say their piece, to hear things out, and make an informed decision on something. Whereas compared to a quote-unquote unanimous decision, just because something's unanimous doesn't necessarily mean that was the best decision-making process. Because if you ever been in a situation where people are it can become like what's called a contest of personality, right? Where people might be afraid to say no, or there's no point in saying me saying anything because this means that they're not going to listen to me at all, right? And so when the meeting kind of gets into that and it becomes a contest of personalities, and you're kind of strong-arming people into unanimous agreement, that's why the authorship team argues that majority vote with debate is a much more powerful decision, because people have come to that like on their own without that sort of like personality pressure and influence, if that makes sense. And so that's sort of the overarching principle of why we're doing some of these things that we're going to be talking about today. And quickly on the right side, if you're a member of an organization, there are the basic rights, things like receiving notice, like being able to go to a meeting, right? People need to know when the meeting's going to happen. And when you're at that meeting, you should be able to put proposals out there, right? So that's called making a motion. Another right is being able to discuss the proposals and to be able to vote on them and have a fair account of that vote. Also, being a member affords you the right to run for or resign from an office, a leadership role, and if there's any sort of expulsion or penalties, some due process. You need to be able to be heard before a penalty is like assigned, essentially. So that's the end of this section. Were there any questions about just the general principles of parliamentary procedure?
Step one, when holding a meeting and you're going to vote, should there be a quorum?
That's the next section. Give me about
All
2
right,
minutes.
Cool. All right.
Yep.
I have a couple of others when you get to
Okay, yep. Okay. So let's go next slide. So this is actually what happens at a meeting. There you go, right? So I promise you're 2 slides ahead of me. No need to apologize at all. Next slide. So we talked about what is parliamentary procedure. Now we're going to talk about what is a meeting, right? We're going to break that whole process down. And again, the whole point of having a meeting is that's when you're gathered to assemble. That's when you're assembled to transact business, right? excuse me, that's where you are coming together. Sorry, were there questions in the chat before I go on? Okay, no questions, okay. That's where we are assembled and gathered to transact a business. And so when you have your meeting, excuse me, I had some sparkling water, it's making me burp a little bit. When you have your meeting, members have to be given notice of the meeting, so people have to know when and where we're going to be meeting. And that can come in different forms. That's probably going to be maybe in your constitution or bylaws about what notice is. I know for a lot of churches, they have to kind of give notice from the pulpit before the meeting and whatnot, or maybe put in like a bulletin and things like that. But what's important is for it to be a valid meeting, you have to have what's called a quorum present. And a quorum is the minimum number of people who have to be there in order for it to be a valid meeting. And the whole point of that is you don't want to have a situation where, oh, this meeting a person, oh, we got together, we talked about this, we made a decision. And it's like, who's to say the two of us can talk on behalf of the group of 100, right? And so you need to have like enough people for it to be a valid meeting. So I don't necessarily know your church's structure, but some churches, I've seen it like two different ways. Some have kind of really rigid membership requirements, whereas like we know who pledges and tithes like their money, so they are members in good standing, and we know this. But others, it's a little bit more loose, and it's like, okay, well, who's come to services and whatnot. And so the quorum, you're going to check your bylaws for whatever that number is going to be. Or it might just be whoever shows up to the meeting ends up being the quorum. And so that's important to kind of have that in mind, because you want to make sure you have enough people there. I mean, if it's not in your bylaws, the default is a majority of the membership. Which just again, depending on how you define members, can be a lot for some groups. So for example, I know my like PTA, Parent Teacher Association, when I was growing up, we pretty much probably had like 1,000 families in it, because everyone just like sent in their check to join the PTA and called it a day. But that was the main like fundraising drive, like give us your membership dues. Like the quorum was like 10 people, because that was like all they really could get for like a board meeting and things like that. And so it was, but that was okay. People, we were like, we want to write a little check and support the school and call it a day. We don't really care about the day-to-day of this and that, the PTA drama. And so people sometimes ask like, well, what's a good number? And again, it just depends on the group's psychology. Some groups, they really want to make sure we have enough people there. Other groups, it's, we trust our leadership, so we'll come to the annual meeting, whatever the case may be. But again, check your bylaws for that number for kind of determining whatever that quorum number is going to be. Are there any questions about quorum at all? Okay. And then typically at your meeting, you have at least 2 officers. Robert says you need to have someone who's going to preside at the meeting, and then someone who's going to make sure they take notes of what happened at the meeting. So at a minimum, they want at least like a president, a chairperson, and a secretary or a clerk to kind of take those notes. Next slide. And so there are 3 types of meetings. You really only run into the first 2, but I'll tell you what all 3 are for educational purposes. The first type is a regular meeting, and that's just the periodic meeting of an organization, whatever that periodic schedule is. Some groups meet once, the membership only meets like once a year to elect officers, and that's just the regular annual meeting, right? Some groups have quarterly business meetings, other groups might have monthly, just whatever that regular schedule is. And so if you're calling a meeting outside that regular schedule, that's when those are called special meetings. And special meetings are outside that regular schedule, and they are called as authorized in your governing documents. And the key about special meetings is when you give notice of your special meeting, you have to say what you're going to be discussing at that meeting. People have to know what's so special about this. Like, why am I coming in this extra meeting to, discuss things? And so that's supposed to be like a check just to make sure like, oh, okay, well, I can't make the special meeting. That's the only thing I missed, right? Versus whatever the sort of regular schedule is going to be. And the last one is called an adjourned meeting or continued meeting. Those are really rare, but essentially you run into those in like 2 instances. And they're pretty much a continuation. They're a continuation of one of those other types of meetings. And you run into those in two main situations. One is if you call that meeting to order and you don't have a quorum, the people who are there are able to reschedule that current session into the future to a date and time that is going to be acceptable to get people to have a quorum, right? So you're continuing the meeting. Or number two is if the meeting is going like really, really late and you still have stuff left on your agenda and you want to pick up where you left off, maybe like a few days from now, you can kind of adjourn the meeting to continue the meeting at that future date, basically. And so that's the two situations where you might run into that. But again, really rare. Next slide. And so if you don't have a quorum, the things that you can do under Roberts are either end the meeting, right? So you're going to adjourn the meeting because you need to have people for it to be valid. You can take a break, which is recessing. You can reschedule the meeting. We just talked about that. Or you can do actions to obtain a quorum, like calling people, kind of getting them to kind of come into your meeting. And the thing is, if members take action at a meeting that there's not a quorum, they can be held personally liable for those actions unless and until the group actually votes and ratifies what they did. And so let's just say, for example, let's say that the roof caved in and you had to do a quick meeting to get a roofer to fix it, right? But you're off by a little bit. You couldn't get enough people to kind of make that quorum. If you still did that, you still took that, you still whoever authorized the purchase for that roofer to get the roof replaced, they're doing so at their own risk until you can at that next meeting or get a quorum, you ratify that action. But let's just say if it's something that's not controversial, let's say it's something that is controversial and there actually is yes and no's, and you go forward and you don't get that ratification because you didn't have your quorum, then that person can be held liable for that money that was spent because you're doing it without authorization of the group, right? And so that's the risk you really run into. People said oh, let's just do it and ratify it. If you're going to do that, make sure it's stuff that people really agree on that are non-controversial, paying for a new roof or something like that, right? Because you don't want to run into that, because if the person does it and then they can't get it ratified, then they can be on the hook for it because they're spending the money without appropriate authorization from a valid meeting. Okay. Next slide. So now we get first little mnemonic, and everyone think of Raisin Bran cereal. We have Mrs. Sun here. I always think about, the raisin, she scoops the little 2 scoops of raisin in every box or whatever, right? And so Mrs. Sun is what we have here for what's called the standard order of business. And Roberts basically says that, hey, if you don't have an agenda and you don't know what to do for your meeting, if you follow the standard order of business, you would have hit everything you need to hit in a meeting. And you call it a day, basically. And a lot of times, agendas are kind of based off of the standard order of business. And so we'll talk at the very end, how this differs from an agenda. But essentially, under Roberts, this is you can hit all these captions at your meeting and pretty much hit everything you need to discuss. If you have no idea where to start, basically. So let's go to the next slide. The first M, Mrs. Sun, minutes. So the first thing you do is it's the reading and approval of the minutes of the previous meeting. And so minutes are a record of what occurred at your meeting. And the idea is, remember, minutes are supposed to be a summary of what was done, not what was said. It's supposed to be the group's endorsement of, okay, these are the actions that we took at this meeting. Because if you need to go back and look at it, you should be able to be oh, okay, we voted on this, we voted on that, we tabled that, and call it a day. Not, oh, well, so-and-so thought this was a great thing, and so-and-so thought that was a bad thing. No, it's supposed to be a summary of what was said, a summary of what was done, not what was said. And once it's approved, it becomes a record of what happened. That's the group pretty much endorsing, saying, hey, we agree, this is what we did at this meeting. And Robert says that when you are sort of reading and approving those minutes at the start of the meeting, it's not supposed to be with a bunch of fanfare and whatnot. Basically, if you have corrections, bring them up, try to handle them by general consent, right? If not, put it to a vote really quickly, and then you can just vote to approve those minutes. Question, yes.
I know you say in the minutes you write down what was done, not said. But what does one person say, I want this to be said, documented in the minutes? And so they can have documentation of what they said.
You can just say, the minutes are supposed to be a record of our actions. If you want to send me an email that you see you have it documented, you can just send an email of what you want to say. Right, no need to attach it. No need to attach it. Yeah.
Good morning, I have a question also.
Good morning.
Good morning, this is Barbara. So as far as a meeting is being held, I guess from Robert's rule is saying that we do need to have an agenda to know exactly what's going on. Is that correct?
Yes and no. So what we're going over right now is what's called the standard order of business, and Robert says that, hey, even if you forgot an agenda, you don't have an agenda, you follow this order of business, you would have hit everything you need to talk about at a meeting, basically. Now we'll talk about at the end why the agenda can be important, right? Because like you said, it can help with transparency and letting people know, like, okay, what exactly is going to be coming up, and maybe time limits and stuff like that. But ultimately, it is technically optional. Technically. Just because it's optional, does that mean it's the best practice? Not necessarily, but that's, why we're here to kind of learn or misconceptions and whatnot today.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Oh, fine. Next slide, please. And so, what I have here is just little basic text or whatever for like minutes. If you just kind of look really quickly, like at the second paragraph, it just says, Dr. C's motion was to approve the strategic plan. So after debate, the motion was referred to staff with instructions to report back at the next meeting with updated revenue projections due to COVID-19, right? And so you don't have to put in the minutes, I want to approve this, but did we consider this? Or I want to approve that, but did we consider that? It's what was proposed, right? The proposal was strategic plan. The result was come back to us next meeting with some updated projections, right? That's pretty much what you're getting at. That's what you're describing there in like 2 sentences, right? This is what Dr. C proposed, and this is what we did with it. We either adopted it or we sent it back to staff, et cetera. And so that's where it's nice and, concise of like kind of what like happened, right? You don't necessarily have to put like the pros and the cons and I don't feel comfortable voting for this because we didn't survey enough people, 5 people said, okay, let's come back. 4 people said, no, I want to vote on it now. 2 people said, I want to vote on it now, right? So it was 5-2 for that one. Next slide. And so the R in Mrs. Sun, reports of officers, standing committees, board, et cetera. And so essentially, when we have reports under Roberts, they, if a committee is like reporting up to a parent body, they are asking the parent body to approve what the recommendation is because they themselves do not necessarily have the authority to do X, Y, or Z. They're bringing it up at the larger meeting to get approval for the recommendation. And this is sort of higher up on the standard order of business because these are things that have been vetted by like a committee or vetted by like an officer or a staff member, whatever the case may be. And so they're well thought out ideas that they just want your approval to implement that recommendation. And ideally, if you have like a longer written report, those are things that can kind of be submitted in advance, distributed in advance, or a report could be like a quick oral summary of things that you did. And ultimately, you're asking for approval on any recommendations by sort of the parent body. Next slide. And the first S in Mrs. Sun is special committee reports, essentially same form and content as the main committee reports, standing committee reports. The only difference is a special committee is appointed for a temporary purpose, and once they've done their final report, they are disbanded. And so that is the difference between the two. Next slide. And so when you sort of have that little format, it's really broken down into three parts is what you really want to get at, right? You want to give like a background, a summary of what you did, right? So whether that's either findings or research, and then any recommendations. And so that's essentially what you're getting at is you're giving some background, your research, and recommendations. You can either just give reports for informational purposes, you can give reports to get feedback, give reports to get approval on your recommendation. Outside of that typical format, typically the treasurer might be asked to give a financial report, right? When you're dealing with numbers, it's really not, the numbers are the numbers, right? And so that might be something different the treasurer or like a finance officer might need to do at a meeting. So next slide. Example we have here, I could say, well, in the full report that was emailed to the board, you'll see pictures that the memorial garden has become infested with bugs, and we have to replace all of our flowers now. This event was not anticipated when we did our budget planning at the beginning of the year, and so we are requesting approval for additional funds to replace the pesticides, and so, to replace the flowers. So on behalf of the landscaping committee, I move that the board authorize an additional $500 for replacement flowers and pesticides for our memorial garden, right? And so following that little format we just talked about, background, we are the landscaping committee, and we did the landscaping, and we saw that the flowers were dead because of bugs. Summary of what you did. We went to the budget, and this is outside the budget because we only asked, we need a little bit more money in order to take care of this because we didn't think this was going to happen this year. Recommendation, give us more money. Does that make sense? Like, I mean, that was a quick, 1 minute report right there, but what we're getting at is, hey, this is our job, this is what we did, this is the little research that we did, and this is the recommendation. We need more money for flowers and pesticides, right? And so, but if the landscaping committee, because if the landscaping committee could do it themselves, they wouldn't have to go to this board and ask for money, right? They could have just did it themselves. But in this situation, they weren't authorized to have that additional $500, and so that's why they're asking for it at this do the committee report to get to recommend and get it from the parent body, if that makes sense. Next slide. So second S, Mrs. Sun, is called special orders. Those are rare. Essentially, if your bylaws say, oh, at the May meeting, we have to do the budget, then at the special order for the May meeting, basically. That's when you mainly run into that. Next slide. U, unfinished business. This is business that was left over from a previous meeting. Robert says never refer to it as old business. It's in a footnote. I guess they think it's it mean to call the business old. It's just unfinished. And then finally, next slide, new business. So that's literally everything else. So it's not the minutes, it's not from a committee, it's not from an officer, it's not required by the bylaws, it's not something you did do the last time, right? It's everything else. And so different organizations have different norms for how they kind of consider those new items of business. And so some groups want things vetted by a committee first, other groups kind of want to do new business for discussion at the first meeting, but then vote on at the next meeting. It all just depends on what your group psychology is. And so really, talk with your leadership about sort of that agenda setting process that you do have to kind of increase the success to kind of get your thing adopted. And unfortunately, I am missing a slide, but I can still talk about it. So outside the standard order of business, we've heard, people ask a question about agendas and stuff like that, right? So how does an agenda differ from a standard order of business? And so an agenda is, instead of just having the 6 captions of what might come up during a meeting, an agenda is going to be more specific and address the order of things, and specifically what might be coming up under each caption. And it might even have time limits, right? Well, at 6 o'clock we're talking about this, and at 6:15 we're talking about that, etc. And so Adopting an agenda is fine, and it's a good practice because it allows people to know exactly what might be coming up like at the meeting. And the key about the agenda is if you adopt your agenda and there's like time limits on it, it takes a majority vote to adopt it, but then once you've reached your time limit, it takes a 2/3 vote to extend the time. And so that can be like a time-saving mechanism, essentially, because if you're gonna agree to like time limits for things, a greater number of people have to agree in order to set those time limits aside once you've reached that time limit. And so that's like a little key there. If you have like a lot of things, you wanna keep things like on track, you can put time limits on the agenda and you adopt it to become more binding on your group. Okay. Any questions about meetings, agendas, the flow of things? Question? Okay.
What would be an appropriate number for a quorum?
Yeah, so the question, oh, sorry, I'm so used to repeating the questions, but there's a microphone there, people can hear it in the Zoom. So again, a quorum, it's really just going to depend on the group. Every group has a different psychology, as I like to say it, right? Some groups have different trust levels of how involved the members want to be in decisions versus letting the officers or trustees do the decisions, right? And so there's different psychologies. And so without knowing the specifics of this group specifically, I find like a lot of churches, they kind of tend to be one of two ways. Either one, they have stricter, like they keep really good membership records and they're more stricter about like, okay, we know who's like pledged and tithe and give and whatnot, so we know like specifically who's like a member. But other groups, it's more like open and, necessarily, oh, so-and-so has been coming here for 20 years or whatever, right? And so it's not necessarily as strict with membership records. And so if it's the first type, it's easier to kind of maybe set like a number and whatnot because you know specifically what you're working with. But the other type, it's harder because that's a family. They've been coming here for years. Maybe they didn't come the last 2 Sundays, but they've been coming for all these years and whatnot. So we want them to still kind of count, right? And so if you have more looser membership requirements, then your quorum requirements end up being like looser because you don't want to. You don't want to like disenfranchise like people, right? And so sometimes the quorum just ends up being, the pastor announces the meeting for 2 Sundays at the pulpit, and then whoever shows up is the quorum, right? So it just depends on the group. I've not seen your bylaws, so I don't want to like speak. That's just in my experience what I've seen different like groups. So.
Second question, then I'll sit down. Are announcements allowed at the end of a special meeting?
Announcements is, yes and no. I mean, like there's like 2 types of announcements, right? One is like a general announcement, like come to my cousin's piano recital like next week. Those sort of things, perfectly fine, right? But when it comes to like sometimes like bylaws, you might have to like announce like, oh, I am proposing to amend our bylaws, this, that, and the third. It might not be allowable at a special meeting because a special meeting is only for a particular item of business, right? And so people weren't aware that, oh, okay, we're going to be discussing bylaws and whatnot, then it would fall from the scope of what you can do at a special meeting. So, okay.
Okay, do meeting norms fall under the Robert's Rules of Order, start on time, end on time, blah, blah, blah? Does that come into this arena?
Meeting norms, like starting at, so, well, I wouldn't necessarily say starting on time, ending on time being a norm. I mean, that is part of the notice process, right? People have to know when and where the meeting is going to happen, right? And so when you're giving notice, you're saying we're going to be meeting this Sunday after the whatever service, right? And so that's, people have to know when the meeting is going to happen. Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, so people coming late and whatnot, that's why you're just giving notice of when the meeting's supposed to start, right? And so, and be there. And I guess, if your chairperson's late, that's why you might have like a vice chairperson, right? And they're the one who's like kind of doing it, right? So, sure. Keep them coming.
If notification is given, a particular issue is going to be addressed, and I guess the members only decide that they're not going to attend or attend, what is the quorum at that point?
So I have to see like what might be in your governing documents to give you a specific answer. But I mean, ultimately, you know, it's probably going to be written down in your constitution, your bylaws, or whatever the case may be. And so for groups that have, you know, more specific like membership like records, right, and they know like who's a member and they have it like with that certainty because they're like paying dues and stuff like that, their quorum is going to be more along the lines of either like a certain number or like a certain percentage, like 15 people or 10% of the membership, whatever the case may be. But if it's more loose membership and like, oh, they've been coming for years and whatnot, it's more about the announcement, right? We're letting people know, advertising the meeting, hey, we're meeting next Sunday, telling from the pulpit, putting it on the church bulletin, et cetera, and who shows up is who shows up. Because I think the idea is if you're active and you've kind of been around or you're like connected with the community, you would have heard about the meeting, right? And so that's sort of the psychology behind it, if that makes sense. So next slide. Now we're going to talk about motions. Ooh, now the meat and potatoes now, right? Like I said, start broad to get more and more specific. So we said, what is parliamentary procedure? Okay, well, where do we do it? And now we're getting into the how do we do it portion, right? And so motions. A motion is a proposal, essentially. A proposal that the group undertake some sort of action or take a stance in some sort of way. You could almost say, I propose that we do something instead of I move that we do something. But this is parliamentary procedure, and it borrows language from 1300s Great Britain. So that's why we still call it motions. And so a main motion is a proposal, it's a substantive proposal that the group undertakes some sort of action. And when you're making your motion, the form is, I move to ... or I move that ... right? So I move to approve the contract. I move to adopt this. I move that we close the pool for the week of June, whatever the case may be. Don't make your motions in the negative. You should not say, I move that we don't do this, right? Because that's going to confuse the voting. If I make a motion to not do something, does voting no make it a double negative, which cancels out, makes it like a yes? So you see, it gets confusing, right? And so that's why your motion's always in the positive. So one of my clients is a housing cooperative, and so if someone wants to sell their unit, they have to give the board the first right of refusal to let the board like buy the shares back, basically, right? And so I was at the coach them saying, your motion is to reject their offer, not well, I move that we don't buy it from them. It's like, no, we move to reject the offer from them, right? Because you want yes, you're right. Your yeses to mean yes, your no's to mean no, right? And so that's kind of what we're getting at here. Some people will say, well, you know, I make a motion or whatever, right? And technically, that is not the precise language that we're using, because if you look at me, I'm making a motion right now. It's a crazy motion, but that's when you're saying, oh, he made a motion. What motion did he make? He was dancing. No, it's I move is the appropriate vocabulary that we are using. Next slide. And so if you ever hear a resolution, right? So what is a resolution? A resolution is going to be a longer written main motion. And if you look on the left side of the slide, it's saying, well, I move that we rename the scholarship to honor Mr. A. That's a motion. Congratulations to Mr. A. Scholarship's named after you. That's not special though, right? What's so special about Mr. A? We need some more reasons behind that. If you look on the right-hand side, you have the preamble, right? These whereas clauses. Whereas Mr. A has been on the board since the 70s, and whereas Mr. A transformed our deficit to $2 million in profit every year, and whereas this and whereas that, therefore be it resolved that the association rename the scholarship in honor of Mr. A. So if you look at the two sides, the little highlights there, I move that and resolved that. It's the same exact text of the motion, right? Just on the right-hand side, the resolution, it's written and you have more background in it with those preamble, those whereas clauses. And so some groups will want to do things in the form of a resolution because it allows you to put like your background and rationale into something. It also is good for presentation purposes, right? Because if you want to present something to someone, you're honoring someone, you can kind of put that out on nice paper, put a seal on it, right? Have it nice and signed and present it to someone versus just, oh, well, here's the excerpt from the minutes, congratulations, right? And so, you know, it can be more presentation wise, or maybe you can kind of give your background and reasoning for why the group undertook a certain action. Also, you'll see some groups that are in that do like policy advocacy and whatnot. They will have resolutions because they'll put like their research and background for it and be like, well, whereas this and whereas that, therefore be it resolved that we stand opposed to the meals tax or whatever, right? They might have like the reasons like on there and kind of have for like policy persuasion purposes. Next slide. And so there are 6 steps to handling emotion. 6 seems like a lot, but we're gonna go over each one, and yeah, we're gonna go over each one. But basically, step 4 is the longest one, but the first couple happen in like 30 seconds. And so the first step to making your motion is someone has to make the motion. And so when you're in your meeting, right, the chairperson's at the front, they're presiding at the meeting. Remember, one thing at a time. The chairperson's calling on whose turn it is to like speak next, right? And so you're going to get recognition from the chair. And so just depending on the size of the group and like whatever the case may be will depend on how you get the chair's attention. And a meeting like when we're gathered here today, like right now, you can probably raise your hand and I can point on you and you can stand up and say your motion. You know, if the pews are filled all the way to the back, you might have to have the system of microphones, right? People walk up to the microphones, get the chair's attention. Excuse me. If you're online, you might need to have people typing in the chat or like a monitor to say, hey, Mr. Chairman, we have a person like on the Zoom trying to say something, right? Whatever the case may be. If you're sitting around like a boardroom table, there's no need to stand up and be like, well, Mr. Chair, I have a motion, because that's kind of awkward. We can all see each other around the table. The chair has a capability, and the secretary, they can request that the motion be put into writing, just in case there's ever like confusion about what exactly the person is saying. So step number 1 is someone makes a motion. Next slide. So now let's do a little bit of practice. Does anyone here want to make a motion? Just remember, it's going to be I move to or I move that. Yeah, give me a sample motion. Give me a sample motion.
I'm gonna make a motion that he can be appointed as I make a motion that we allow free parking on parking lot.
Okay, good. So A minus. So we're gonna take that. See the very bottom of the slide. So read the last thing, that last line on the slide, if you can. It says, I move that. Free parking, right? So that's it, right? So I move to or I move that, basically. Very good. Anyone else have a motion? I always get the fun one. I move to adjourn, right? Second, right? Yeah, so there's things.
I move that all the lights stay on in the church at all times.
Okay, that could be one. Or sometimes, I move to bring back a Wednesday night supper or something, whatever the case may be. So yeah, I mean, just kind of think about that. There are different proposals, right, that will be considered depending on whomever, like whatever group you're in, whatever authority you may have, right? And so sometimes like the board of trustees, oversees certain things that, I don't know, the deacon board might like see different things, right? So just depending on whatever's within your competency and authority will kind of dictate the stuff that you can discuss at a meeting. Okay. Next slide. So The second step to handling a motion is someone else seconds the motion. And then they can just kind of yell out second from their seat, or they can kind of get up and go to the mic if they really want to. But the whole point of getting a second to the motion is just to make sure you're not wasting your time discussing something that literally only one person wants to talk about. If I am seconding the motion, that doesn't necessarily mean that I agree with the motion. That just means I think that's worth our time discussing at this meeting. Sometimes people second a motion because they want to hear more, want to hear a discussion. Maybe they want to second it so they can see it on record that it does not, that it fails, right? And so by seconding the motion, you're just saying, you know, I think this is worth our time discussing. Because what you don't want to have is a meeting that's, you know, where you're discussing something that literally only one person wants to talk about. So it's a very low bar to reach. It's just pretty much making sure you have at least two people that say, okay, we can discuss this. Roberts does say that the second is not the biggest deal, because if you forget to get the second, but you end up having a good discussion anyway, there's no point in going back and asking for the second. Like it didn't serve its purpose, right? Because you're discussing it like anyway. And so that's sort of, Roberts says that's okay if you forget it, but ultimately, if there is no second, then the chair says, well, there is no second, so this motion will not be considered. Is there any other new business? That sort of thing. The third step, so someone makes the motion, someone else seconds it. The third step is the chair is going to state that motion, right? And so, like I said, like it's 6 steps. The first 3 are very quick. Someone makes a proposal. Second, okay, it's a move to close the parking lot, right? And so, and this step is important because with the person who's chairing the meeting, Robert says you can be helpful. You're allowed to help someone like reword their motion if it's like ambiguous, right? Did you mean the front parking lot or the back parking lot that you want to have the free parking or whatever? And so the chair can help the person reword the motion to make sure we're all on the same page of what exactly is being voted on or going to be discussed. If there is a motion that violates like the bylaws or pardon me, or the Constitution or something, the chair can rule the motion out of order at that point. But we're pretty much dealing with the chair is kind of setting the stage right for the debate, because once the chair kind of states the motion, it becomes what's called the property of the assembly, and now it's everyone's turn to sort of debate it, and the next sort of cuts it off, because remember we talked earlier about one thing at a time, and so once it's been moved and seconded it and stated, this is the only thing we're discussing at the meeting right now until we're done with it. Next slide, and this is the longest step, is it's time to debate the motion. And so that's where the meat and potatoes of where we're at, right? Being a deliberative assembly. People are discussing the pros and cons. Should we do this? Should we not do that? And again, the chairperson, it's their role to assign the floor. They're picking whose turn it is to go. And so there's different principles, right? They're supposed to let everyone else go speak a first time before someone else is recognized for a second time. To the extent that the chair is aware, they can try to alternate between pro and con. If you know who might be for and against it, or the chair can say, well, we've had speakers speak in favor of this. Does anyone want to speak against this? Whatever the case may be, to keep the debate fair and balanced. The debate, it has to be related to the business at hand. And so, like if we were discussing something about the parking lot, we can't be bringing up, the 50th anniversary gala or whatever, right? We were discussing the parking lot like right now, and then we are finishing that, and then you can make your motion about the gala. But then also what's key is during this debate phase is where you can propose what are called secondary motions, or I like to call them the procedural motions, but they aren't items of business themselves, but they help alter how you're considering the item of business. And what do I mean by that? Like during your debate, if you want to end the debate or make the debate go longer, you can do a motion for that. But these are all things that are going to happen during that debate phase. And so it's the longest phase, but it's also the most important. Next slide. And so at the conclusion of the debate, the chair is going to state the motion one more time, right? And so this is important because this is what people are going to hear in their ears right before they vote on something. And then if there's ever like a discrepancy between like, oh, how so-and-so said it and how this was said and how that was said, this is the form of the motion that goes into the minutes because that's what people heard right before they voted on it, right? And so the chair is going to say, is there any further debate? Okay. Hearing none, the question is on adoption of the motion to hold the Jubilee Gala, right? Whatever the case is. Then the next step, the last step, the chair is going to put the motion to a vote. Those in favor say aye, aye. Those opposed say no, no. The ayes have it, the motion is adopted, right? And so that is, next slide. So that's sort of the 6 steps that we are at, right? So someone's going to make the motion, someone else is going to second the motion, the chair is going to state the motion, the members are going to debate the motion, the chair is going to state the motion one more time, and then you vote on it. And so again, 6 seems like a lot, but the way it's set up is to make sure that, again, we have the check to make sure that we're using our time wisely, that we have something that is worth discussing. We're making sure that the debate is relevant and at hand. We're making sure that we know what we're voting on before we vote on it, right, before we actually do the vote. One more slide. And so that was 6 steps. Question always is, Donald, how can we save time for those 6 steps? Here's the answer. There's a procedure called unanimous consent or general consent under Robert's Rules of Order. And how does that work? Robert's Rules of Order says in cases where there's not like a lot of opposition and it's like a routine business, something or a question of little importance, you can save time by doing unanimous consent. So how does that work? Step number 1. The chair or member will ask for unanimous consent. The chair can say, well, if there are no objections, if there's no objections, the motion will be agreed to. Or the member can say, I ask unanimous consent that we adopt this motion, or whatever the case may be. Step 2, if one person objects, then you have to go through the 6 steps. Or step 3, if no one objects, then the motion is agreed to. And so again, that's for things like, actually the minutes are a really good example, right? The minutes, they're sent out, the chair can ask, well, are there any additions or corrections to the minutes? Are there any objections to approving the minutes? Okay, hearing no objections, the minutes will be approved as distributed, right? We just did the minutes in 10 seconds that way. You're able to do that for more things. And so the check and balance you have is any one person can insist that, no, I want us to go through the typical 6-step process, right? Or we all can agree, okay, this is something that is agreeable. We can just bypass the 6 steps and agree to it by unanimous consent. Some groups will have something called like a consent agenda, and it's a similar process to where they might have like 5 things on it, and then a chair can ask, does anyone want one of these things pulled for separate consideration? One member can pull one thing, you vote on the other 4 up or down, and you go back to the one thing that got pulled, right? And so similar principle to where you can kind of save time doing unanimous consent. Let's see, were there any questions about motions? Do you want to do like a 5-minute stretch break really quickly? No?
My name, this is Norman Freeman. I have a question.
Okay.
Motion.
Okay.
There is a discussion, and the discussion identifies a proposed change to the motion. Would you walk through the handling of a change or an amended?
It's 2 sections. Give me, that's coming up.
Okay, all right.
That is coming up. But to answer really quickly, essentially, you're gonna be doing the same process, right? You're gonna start the 6 steps over again. This is like during step number 4, the debate phase. You'll start the process over again, which is either if it's like a certain if it's like a certain change that everyone kind of agrees to, the chairperson can do unanimous consent, right? Well, are there any objections to changing the wording to X? Okay, if there's no objections, that amendment will be agreed to. Hearing none, the amendment is agreed to, right? You can do it that way, or I object, or you just go through the 6 steps one more time, but only for the amendment itself. Okay, so no stretch break? We're good, I see. Or stretch break? 5 minutes? Five, okay, we'll give it 5, so 11:20, 5 little stretch break. How about that? Okay. Oh, can you hear me? Oh,
Turn the mic up.
oh, it's up? Okay.
Back on,
Oh,
yeah.
okay, thank you. Sorry, okay. And so a majority, so more people voted against A than voted for A, but because this is the rule that was decided upon, A still wins the election. And so, I mean, we have that in real life, right? With our governmental elections and whatnot. We don't have time to do lots of revotes and recounts and whatnot. It's just whoever gets the most votes ends up winning. And so sometimes that's what the rule is. We can go from there. And let's see, this next example for secretary, we have 24 votes for Washington, 24 votes for Jefferson, and 2 abstentions. In that instance, no one wins the election, right? It's a tie vote. And so you have to do another round of balloting in that instance because no one got a plurality vote on that one. Next slide. And so the most important definition I have for you all day is majority means more than half. Majority means more than half. Not 1/2 plus 1, not 51%, it's more than half. And so for the example we have here, these motions pass or fail by majority vote. And so in the first example, we have 40 yes votes, 5 no votes, and 5 abstains. Does that motion pass? Well, you have the answer up there already, but it passes, right? Because 40 is more than 5, right? Think about the alligator hands and chalkboard from elementary school. Which number is bigger than the other one, right? That's what we're getting at with some of these things, right? 25 yes votes, 25 no votes. That motion's going to fail because that's a tie vote, not a majority vote. So majority is more than half. And so in that instance, since 50 people voted, half of 50 is 25, so you need at least 26 for it to be a majority. And so if it's 25-25, it fails. The next question that I will get is, oh, well, can the chair just break the tie, right? And so how it works under Roberts is the chair does not get like a extra super tie-breaking vote. What happens is the chair chooses to not vote, and then if their vote's going to impact the result, then they break the tie, right? And so in this instance, we're assuming, because you got like a direct count, it was probably like a little ballot vote, and so 25 ballots yes, 25 ballots no, and so if it's a ballot vote, the chair can already vote in a ballot because no one knows how they voted, because they can still keep their impartiality on an issue. And so in that instance, if the chair was part of that 50 had already voted, the chair does not get a super second vote to then break the tie, if that makes sense. And so any sort of tie breaking is the chair choosing to not vote and then exercising their vote if there is a tie without them. And then that last example we have 15 yes votes, 9 no votes, and 26 abstentions. And in that instance, again, the motion is going to pass because when we're doing just a basic majority vote, we're looking at more than half of those who voted on something. And so people, even though 26 people said, I'm not going to vote on this at all, they ceded their ability, their right to the organization to do anything to everyone else who did vote on something. And so the abstentions do not count towards getting a majority vote. They count towards quorum because they're present at the meeting, right? But they chose not to vote when they were at the meeting. And so that is a key there to where, if you're not voting, letting everyone else make the decision, letting everyone else make the decision for you instead of you participating in the decision-making process. Next slide. So 2/3. So 2/3 is at least 2/3. And so the best way to do that is to take the number of people who voted. So take the yeses and the nos and combine them. You double it, so you times it by 2, and then you divide by 3. You want to make sure the number is at least that number. And so I'm going to pull out my phone calculator really quickly. And so in this instance, we have in the first example, we have 33 yes votes and 17 no votes, right? So let's add that up together. So 33 and 17 is 50, right? We're gonna times 2, that's 100, and divide by 3. 33.333333. So is 33 at least 33.33333? No, right? So in that instance, you would need at least 34 votes. And so again, we have to go back to second grade, the greater than, less than, alligator arms, right? And so which one is 33? You have 33 on this side, 33.333 on that side. That side is bigger, so it is not at least 2/3. And so you would need 34 votes for that one. Let's see. Next one, you have 25 yes and 25 no. It's the same thing, right? It's 50 people voting, so you need at least 34 votes. So that motion's gonna fail as well too. And then the last one, we have 16 yes, 8 no, and 26 abstain. So we're gonna do 16 plus 8, because remember, we don't count the abstentions when we're just doing a short calculation. So you have 24 people voting, right? So we're gonna times it by 2. That's 48. You're gonna divide it by 3. That's 16. Is 16 at least 16? Yes. So that motion passes. So when something's done by like a 2/3 vote, typically you will take the vote by like a rising vote or like a hand raising vote, just because it's easier to visually see 2/3 bigger than another versus being able to orally hear that, if that makes sense. The main time you're gonna run into a 2/3 vote is anything dealing with like debate. So previous question, any debate, maybe like amending bylaws and things like that. That's the main time you'll hear a 2/3 vote. Otherwise, most decisions are made by majority vote under parliamentary procedure. Okay. And the last slide in this section, you have to be very, very careful of the word of. So sometimes with the way constitutions and bylaws are written, they are written with unintended consequences sometimes. And so what does that look like? So it says be very careful, because under Roberts, majority vote and majority of are different, or it's same thing for 2/3 and whatnot. So in this example, the XYZ Club has 98 members and 50 people went to the last meeting. The bylaws say that the treasurer can be removed by 2/3 of the membership. At that last meeting, all 50 people voted to remove the treasurer. It was unanimous. Did that motion pass? See, that says 100 in there. It should be 98. My bad. But regardless, the motion did not pass because the way the bylaws are written, it says a 2/3 of the whole membership, not a 2/3 vote, right? So if it was just a 2/3 vote, the treasurer would be removed because that was unanimous at that meeting. But because the way the bylaw was written, it has to be 2/3 of the whole membership. That's you would need 66 yes votes in order to remove the 66 votes in order to remove the treasurer. And so that's just an example of how like the word of versus the word vote, 2/3 of versus 2/3 vote could change the whole vote calculation that you might have. And so next time, you're in an organization, look in those bylaws and see like, okay, is this a 2/3 of? So as a parliamentarian, because sometimes we get things that say like, oh, by a 2/3 majority vote of the whatever, like, we have to like break it down, like actually like sometimes like diagram the sentence and be like, okay, what is this referring to get what actually the vote threshold is going to be. So were there any questions about voting? A little bit of math on your Saturday morning, hopefully not too bad. Just kind of think about greater than, less than, alligator arms. But remember, majority means more than half. Okay, next section and last section. So we're gonna be talking about secondary motions, and these are procedural motions. They aren't items of business themselves. They just alter how the thing is going to be considered in the group as a whole. Next slide. And so secondary motions, these are going to be motions that are going to come up during the debate phase of the main motion. And the key is they are going to be voted on, you're gonna follow the 6 steps again, and the key is you vote on the procedural motion before you complete that before you vote on the main motion as a whole. And I have examples of what that looks like. But essentially for your secondary motions, they are gonna help you make more nuanced decisions. If you go to the next slide. And so what do I mean by that? So for example, let's say the motion we're talking about is I move to hold a fundraising gala at the Hilton next month, right? That's what the motion is. If you follow the 6 steps, you eventually will get to like a yes, no vote. Yes, you hold at the Hilton, or no, we don't hold at the Hilton, right? We do this event. But as we know, in life, we can have different outcomes to that decision, right? Maybe you want to hold it at a different place or a different time. Or maybe you want to hold a yard sale instead of a fundraising gala. Or maybe we need a more detailed plan. Or we want to think on it and come back to the next meeting. Or maybe we need to ignore this idea because it keeps coming up every single meeting and we keep voting it down, right? Or maybe we need to conduct this vote by a secret ballot to get everyone's true opinion on it. The secondary motions help you do that, right? And so, for example, if I want to hold, the motion is to hold the fundraising gala next month, maybe I want to do it next year instead. So I would do my motion to amend it by taking out that word month and putting in the word year instead, right, to make the motion to hold it next year. And so that's why we have secondary motions and procedural motions, is to be able to help make those nuanced decisions, to help really get it to what's going to be there for a majority, that's going to have majority support, get the real consensus of the group. So next slide. I wish I had it like step by step. Unfortunately, I don't though, but I'll have to describe it for you. And so we'll focus on the left side right now. And so what we have is our ABCs. So we'll start with A. So we have our motion. The first motion is I move to hold a potluck. Second, discussion. We're discussing about holding a potluck. Oh, well, the motion is great, but I need more details. Or, oh, but who's going to bring what to the potluck? I have no idea. Going back and forth. I need more details. And so someone else or someone can say, well, I move that we amend this motion by adding in those words in January, right? And then someone else is second, and okay, well, chair is going to start the process all over again. So right now, you're only discussing whether or not the potluck's going to be held in January, the pros and cons of that. And then during that debate, someone says, you know what, Mr. President, I don't care if it's in January, I don't care if it's in February, but we need a more detailed plan in order to make sure we're all on the same page with what's going on with this potluck. So I move that we refer this motion to the events committee so they can come back with a detailed plan and a sign-up sheet and a location and stuff like that so I can vote on this and be comfortable voting on it, right? So you have your motions. I think of them as like stacking plates, right? Plate A, potluck motion. Plate B, hold it in January. Plate C, send it to the events committee. And so when you're doing the dishes, you start the plate that's on top first, or else the other one's going to come like crashing down. And so you do it. The motions were made in ABC order, but you get rid of them or consider them in CBA order. You vote on them in CBA order. And so the first vote you'll do is whether or not to send it to the events committee, because if you vote that yes, it's sent to the events committee, you're done, you go on to the next thing. You vote that no, then you go to the amendment. You vote that up or down, but at the end, you're going to be voting on A, either A as amended or A as originally if the amendment was not agreed to. Now, this can become academic at times because that's part of becoming like a PRP. It's like, well, this is pending, that is pending, that's pending. Like, what do you do first and whatnot? In my experience, in most groups, you really will just you might just have like A and B. It doesn't really, hopefully, it doesn't really get up to like C, D, E, F and stuff like that. And if not, at least chairperson, insist on let's just do A and B. We're gonna do B first, and then we'll go back to what you were talking about, right? To kind of keep the meeting on track. And so I think the main thing to get across though is if you sort of have that secondary or procedural motion, you kind of handle that, and then you do the main motion in its entirety. But I think in lots of groups, you'll have A or B, A and B at most. You won't get to like the other things. But I'm just showing this as like an academic exercise to kind of let you see like what it looks like. Next slide. And so when you're doing your main motion, here's some popular secondary motions that we do have. One is changing the wording of a motion, right? And that's really important because Amendments allow you to offer alternatives and maybe even massage the wording to make sure it's acceptable to a majority of the group. Another popular one is to send something to a committee, staff, a board, whatever the case may be. You can say it's a motion to refer, and so you can say I move to refer it. You can either name the committee, or you can say a special committee of 5 appointed by the chair, whatever the case may be. But the whole idea is, if you've ever been like a meeting where, if instead of 5 people just like taking up the whole meeting time, if they just got together and sat in a room, they could work out their differences and bring back the recommendation to the whole group. That's what motion to refer is for sometimes. Because sometimes it's, it's like, we're really close on this, but if you guys could just like get in your corner and just work it out with your recommendation and come back to us at the next meeting, we'll be able to really vote on it. You can use refer for that to help also save time at your meetings. Postpone is so, and at the end we'll talk about the difference between like postpone and tabling and whatnot, but postponing is to defer action on something. And so the whole purpose of like postponing though is it's to pretty much make an unfinished business at the next meeting. And so you can either postpone the motion until like later on in the current session or like the next session. If you want to postpone something longer than the next session, and that's when you need to kind of send it back to like a committee so they can kind of have it for longer so you can have it for a time longer than before the next meeting. And last is things dealing with debate. So that's ending debate, previous question, things like that. Those are the ones that can take a 2/3 vote. So during your debate phase, you can say, well, I move limit debate to 10 more minutes, or I move that we close debate at 12 o'clock, or I move to end debate and vote now. All those sorts of things take a 2/3 vote. Yeah, if you ever hear previous question means end debate and vote now. The common misconception is people say like, oh, I call the question. But not one person does not have the right to just end debate on something. Instead, if someone says, I call the question, you treat that as unanimous consent request to end debate. So the chair can say, well, are there any objections to ending the debate? Okay, hearing no objections, the question is called, right? But if someone says, I still want to debate, that's when you go through the 6 steps again, right? And do it by the 2/3 vote to end your debate. So I call the question is technically, they don't have the complete right to do that, but they can ask unanimous consent that the debate be over or move the previous question. Okay, next slide. So we're going to talk about the motion to amend in detail. That's the one we're going to go into detail about, because just to kind of show you different ways to make amendments, because it's important, because that's part of when we talked about earlier being on like the minority side. Motion to amend is a way to offer an alternative, right? Because if you say, well, let's do the fundraising gala, I say, well, let's do a yard sale instead, right? I think the yard sale is going to raise just as much money as after we do all the expenses of the fundraising gala, and you can kind of offer an alternative. So yeah, amending is about changing the meaning or wording of that main motion. And amendments, they have to be germane. They have to be related to the main motion, but they don't have to be quote unquote friendly. Have you ever heard of like a friendly amendment? Amendments don't have to be friendly, they have to be related to it. And so you're able to offer an alternative to something, but it doesn't necessarily have to be in support of it. It can be a different path to it, and we have examples of that. And the way you're going to do that is you're going to say, I move to amend the motion by, and you're going to describe the wording of what you want the amendment to be. And again, you vote on the amendment first, and then you do a separate vote on the main motion, whether either the main motion as amended or the main motion as proposed if the amendment did not get adopted. Next slide. And so 3 methods of amendment. You're either going to put some words in there, you're going to take some words out, we're going to take some words out and replace them with something else, right? That's the 3 ways of changing the wording of something. If you ever hear like the word a substitute, like a substitution, that refers to striking out like a whole page or a whole section or a whole paragraph and substituting it for something else. So next slide. And so let's see, we have here, let's say your current motion is, I move that the baseball league be open to children aged 5 to 11 who live in Henrico County. Walter thinks that the city children should also be able to participate in the baseball league, right? And so in order to change the wording of this motion, he would say, I move to amend the motion by adding and Richmond City, right? Because that would add Richmond City to the list of eligible places for the baseball league, right? And so they would make that motion second to get a second, and then you would just debate on whether or not to include the city kids with the baseball league. So if you vote yes, you would amend the motion, and you would still have to vote on the main motion as amended. Or if you vote no, you're still with the main motion. You still have to do one final vote on that main motion. And so if you look there at that bottom bullet, if the amendment is adopted, it's, I move the baseball league be open to the children in the county and the city. Does that make sense? And so by adding in and the city, you're sort of, you're offering an alternative, right? Because it's not necessarily, someone might necessarily see it as friendly, but it's still related to establishing the baseball league in general in the Richmond area, right? And so that's what we have there. Next one, next motion, let's say your motion is, I move to purchase a tape recorder for the secretary. But member A thinks the secretary also needs some AI voice transcription software to assist with the writing the minutes. Because it's not enough to just have the recording of the meeting, we need to have a transcript made and whatnot to really help you get the motions down in your minutes. So I move to amend the motion by inserting and voice transcription software after the word recorder. So second, and then now you're debating whether or not to add in the voice transcription software. And then if your amendment is adopted, the motion would read, I move to purchase a tape recorder and voice transcription software for the secretary. Again, in that instance, during the debate, you could say, you know, Mr. President, I really support this motion. The secretary needs a tape recorder to help with the minutes, but they also need software to go along with it. So I ask unanimous consent. Can we amend this by putting in this voice transcription software with the tape recorder? The chair can say, okay, were there any objections to amending the motion by add in the voice transcription software? Okay, there's no objections, the motion's amended, and now the motion reads to purchase a tape recorder and voice transcription software for the secretary. Okay. Next slide, taking some words out. Let's say your motion is to appoint A, B, C, and D to the commission, but G says C shouldn't be on the commission. That reminds me, remember that book, Chicka Chicka Boom Boom? Will there be enough room? It's like A told B and B told C. Me at the top of the coconut tree. That reminded me of that. But Dr. G said C shouldn't be on the commission, right? And so the motion might be, well, I move to amend the motion by striking out C, right? So that amendment is adopted. It would be, I move to appoint A, B, and D to the commission, right? And so in that instance, it is, you're striking things out from like a list of things. Let's see, next slide. And then for amendment, finally, we have strike out and insert. And so let's just say the motion is, I move that we hold the convention in Atlanta. But member B says, I think the convention should still be in Memphis because Memphis has better barbecue than Atlanta. And I want to have barbecue after our business meetings. And so my motion, I move to amend the motion by striking out Atlanta and inserting Memphis, right? And then so someone seconds it. Now you're debating the wisdom of whether or not to hold the convention in Memphis versus Atlanta. And so you can see from here, this is a way to offer an alternative, right? The recommendation could have been to hold it in Atlanta, but you also got bids from Memphis and Honolulu and Nashville, or whatever the case may be. You're able to say, well, I want to get on the record, I want us to vote on doing it in Memphis before we decide to do it in Atlanta. And that's the way to do that. And so that's the motion. Remember, the amendments have to be germane. It's related to, because we're picking a place to hold a convention at, but it might not necessarily be the place the committee recommended, but it's the place that I think we should go to. And so you try to convince people to pick Memphis instead and get your yes votes on Memphis, but if that ends up failing, then ultimately you're still going to do voting on Atlanta, or if it passes, then you vote on holding a convention in Memphis. Does that make sense? you see how amendments, they have to be related, but not necessarily friendly and whatnot. And then next slide, this is the last slide we got. And so we're talking about kind of deferring action. And so this comes up during, meetings when you are like discussing certain things, right? And you might not be ready to take a vote on it then and there. And so there are different motions that do different things in Roberts, and so I'm here to educate you on sort of the differences between them, and maybe help you use the vocabulary right to make sure you're saying exactly what you mean to say. And so if you ever hear postpone indefinitely, that means to kill a proposal essentially, or to avoid a direct vote on something. And so if you're it's used a lot of the times for proposals that keep coming up and we keep rejecting it, and we're not right, or something you want to avoid like a direct vote on. And so so while the motion is being discussed, you would make your motion, you would say, well, Mr. Chair, I move to postpone this indefinitely, right? You get a second, debate, vote. A yes vote would postpone it indefinitely, which means would kill it, and a no vote would mean it's not postponed indefinitely. And so that's just a way to indirectly dispose of something without taking a direct yes or no vote on it. You contrast that to postpone definitely, right, or postpone to a certain time. And that is, again, to make something unfinished business at the next meeting, or you're postponing it to later on in the current meeting. And this also is majority vote and debatable. And the key about postpone to a certain time is you need to articulate when that certain time is. So I move to postpone it until after the prayer, or to 6 o'clock, or the next meeting. And so you can postpone it to the next meeting so long as your meeting happens within a quarterly time interval, essentially. And so no later than like about 3 or 4 months from now. And that's like as long as it can be postponed to like the next regular meeting you have. Now, if you hear like table, and so table is one of those motions that gets misused a lot under Roberts, because as we talked about at the beginning, like the government will use a different rule book than what we do in Roberts. So in Congress, if you hear, oh, that got tabled, that has a different meaning than what it means like for typical organizations that use like Roberts Rules of Order. And so tabling is setting something temporarily aside because like an emergency like popped up, right? Like let's say I was running an hour late, and so you decide to do the other things you had in your agenda, and then I come running in and say, I'm here, I'm ready to present, right? So what you do is you move to table the thing that you're discussing to make room for me in my presentation, right? I leave, and then you take it from the table to bring it back, right? So that's the appropriate use of the motion to table, is you're temporarily setting aside something because to make room for something that had like popped up. And so, if there's like a thing to where you think you need like more time, you think the group needs more time on something, or you think it needs like more consideration and thought and study, that's when you would either postpone it to make a motion to postpone it to the next meeting, or maybe send it back to a committee and whatnot in order to kind of get those things worked out. But ultimately, table really isn't used to kill things, right, or and whatnot. It's really just for temporarily setting things aside. And I mean, sometimes people they might say like, oh well, we're not ready to vote on this and whatnot, and that's when you would use the one in the middle. But if that does not pass, ultimately, once it's time to vote on something, you need to vote like yes or no. And if voting no is perfectly fine, if it's like a situation where you just don't feel comfortable with the yes vote, you're perfectly okay to vote no on it. But it's not like, you shouldn't like kind of use this at the tools and whatnot as like a strategy to try to like keep delaying the action if enough of the group is okay with it being voted on at that one meeting, if that makes sense. So I think that was the only question that we got submitted, was about like what's the difference between the different tablings and whatnot. And so again, most groups, you're only supposed to table something if it is, something came up and you want to put it to the side, you take it from the table, versus like setting a time to where it comes back to you again, right? That middle option. A true deferral versus kind of like, we'll table it. Okay. General questions? Anyone, other questions? Next slide really quickly. So this resource is for further study. Actually, I could not find my new version. But this is the Robert's Rules of Order newly revised in brief. It's the quick version of it. I like to say it's written for if you're like on an airplane ride to like a meeting, you can kind of read through it like an airplane ride. It's about like 100 pages. It has like scripts and stuff in it. And it's really like a little study companion to kind of go between the big reference book there. So they have the Robert's Rules of Order in briefs. Just make sure it has like a little R crest in the middle. It's by the same authorship team. If you go to the National Association of Parliamentarians website, they have like a study guide there that follows the book itself. So you can kind of quiz yourself if you have like questions and make sure you're kind of understanding the nuances. My website's also lastminutemeetings.net. I do blog posts every once in a while. I don't think I did one last year though, so I apologize. I need to go do one when I get home. But I try to like kind of have little updates like that and answer like commonly asked questions and whatnot. And I'll leave these with him. I have these little handout, little handout things. I just kind of have like little scripts for the motions and what to like when to say things at the meeting and whatnot. A little takeaway with you. But other than that, I will happily answer any questions or anything I did not address or a situation you want my take on or anything.
Yes, sir. This is Doug Richardson. I had one question.
Hello.
See. My question is, when something is tabled, you were talking about that just now. Mm-hmm. What's the procedure for bringing it back to the table? Is there a procedure for that? In other words, rather than let this thing linger on, because I can keep it on the table for a year, I think, but is there a procedure for bringing it back? And how long does it have to be tabled? Can it be tabled?
Sure. So remember, when we're talking about tabling under Roberts, that's temporarily setting aside because something popped up, right? And so essentially, once the thing that popped up is no longer a thing, you do a motion, take it from the table, or the chair can say, well, there's no objections, we're going to take this from the table because the interruption is taken care of now. Now, if you forget to take it from the table, that's when it becomes unfinished business at the next meeting. But essentially, the appropriate use of tabling something is you're in the middle of discussing something, an emergency popped up. You put the item of business on the table to deal with the emergency, and you take it from the table when the emergency is done with. So that's so.
But when it comes back, it's under unfinished business.
So if you forget to take it from the table at that same meeting, it's unfinished business at the next meeting. Yeah. But yeah, in an ideal world, an appropriate use is once you deal with your little emergency, then you take it from the table and go on. Okay. Anyone else? I think we're all good. Like I said, I'm a resource, so he has my contact information. So if things come up, he can just email me, and then we'll make sure it gets addressed for you. But thank you for having me, and I hope everyone learned at least one thing today. Thank you. I'll pass these out.
Thank you, everyone. This resource he's handed out in person, you'll leave that whole stack? Or?
Good stack of it, I will.
He'll leave a good stack. I'll keep whichever, just let me know how many you leave, and if anything, we'll run copies. As this is a nice little summary. Chances are we'll probably just run copies. if you want one. But thank you much. Still within the time frame. Beat the clock by 3 minutes. I appreciate everyone. Again, there will be a recording of this. Again, it's not just the slides, it's his explanation and kind of the detail he goes through. So if you know someone who says, I missed it, it will be made available. Thank you, and I'll see you on the first Sunday tomorrow. Thank you.